Hey everyone, my name is Tim, and this is So You Want Me to Believe. As a side note, before I get started here, I just want to apologize that this episode is a little bit late. If you follow me on social media, I did post that I was going to post it a little bit late. The reason for that was I was out of town this weekend. My brother got me tickets to a convention called C2E2 in Chicago, which is the Chicago Comic and Entertainment Expo. And it was a lot of fun, but I was away from a computer for the whole weekend, so I wasn't able to finish uploading everything that I needed to and doing all of my editing. So I'm really sorry. I hope it wasn't too much of an inconvenience for you, but here it is. Also, I did get some feedback from you guys that said that you would prefer the episodes to be anywhere from half an hour to 45 minutes. I'm trying to stick to that. I think this episode might be a little bit short of half an hour, but I will try in the future to make them the length that you have requested. I've gotten some pretty great feedback about my last couple of episodes. Seriously, thank you so much for listening and keep the feedback coming. And feedback doesn't have to mean nice, positive comments, although I do love the nice comments I've been getting. But if you do have any constructive criticism, I want to hear that too. If there's a way that you think I could improve the show, please send me an email at sywmtbpod@gmail.com. I also think I've developed a new format for the show where I discuss intertwined stories, like I did with last week's episode. I don't know if every episode will be like that, but I've been finding some really interesting things while doing my research, and I think that'll help ensure what I'm producing is hopefully interesting and entertaining, but it'll also help to show how no incident is an isolated incident, and even the strangest of occurrences can be linked to others in one way or another. Keep in mind, though, that this podcast focuses almost entirely on the what-if aspect of everything, so I may find a link, but that doesn't make it a fact of the case. For example, Elisa Lam is only linked to the elevator game by a theory derived from her behavior in an elevator surveillance video. That is a theorized link, but that does not make it a fact of the case. I simply want to make you think about it in a way you may not have before, or that would not have organically occurred to you. Now, as per usual, I want to get a couple of business items out of the way before I start discussing this week's topic. The first thing I want to talk about is my Patreon page. If you don't already know, Patreon is an online membership platform that provides business tools for creators to run a subscription content service. It allows subscribers or patrons to help creators to continue producing content while offering exclusive rewards and perks for their support. The link to my Patreon page is www.patreon.com/sywmtbpod. There are 3 tiers, each with their own set of incentives. If you'd like to check those out, follow that link to the page and they are listed there for you. If you do like the show, please consider subscribing to the Patreon. Everyone who subscribes not only gets exclusive content, but it goes a long way in helping me produce the show. Any support is greatly appreciated. I also want to plug Buzzsprout. I don't have enough of a listener base to get an actual sponsor, so to be clear, Buzzsprout is not sponsoring this show. But they are a great service that offers content creators affiliate partnerships, so I do want you to know about them. Buzzsprout is a podcast hosting service that allows creators to put the content they make out into the world. If you've ever been interested in starting your own podcast, like I'm doing now, Buzzsprout is an excellent resource to help you achieve that goal. Following the link in the show notes lets Buzzsprout know I sent you, get you a $20 Amazon gift card if you sign up for a paid plan, and help support the show. I use Buzzsprout, and it's really helped make putting out the podcast an easy task. Buzzsprout offers a lot of useful and convenient features, like tons of guides to help you find the right equipment at the right price, getting your show listed in every major podcast platform, and by providing a great-looking podcast website that includes audio players that you can drop into other websites, detailed analytics to see how people are listening, tools to promote your episodes, and more. Podcasting isn't hard when you have the right partners. The team at Buzzsprout is passionate about helping you succeed. So join over 100,000 podcasters already using Buzzsprout to get their messages out to the world. Alright, that's enough of that. So let's get into the topic for this week's episode. This week I have more of a story to tell rather than a factual case. This story is actually a creepypasta that circulated online, one which people believe to be true for some time after it was released. This story is the Russian sleep experiments, also known as orange soda. As you've probably gathered from the title of this week's episode, the story is about an inhumane experiment gone wrong. I don't want to just tell you about this story though, so I'm literally just going to read the story to you verbatim. It's a good one though, otherwise I wouldn't be sharing. Normally I wouldn't do this, but when I first read the story several years ago, I thought it was true myself, although the ending kind of goes off the rails a little bit. But it's one of my favorite stories, so I want to share it with you all today. After I'm done telling the orange soda story, I have a few real-life cases of inhumane experimentation that really did take place that I want to talk about, so hold on for that as well. This creepypasta was posted in 2010 by a user who simply identified himself as Orange Soda, but still remains anonymous to this day. It was originally posted in a forum dedicated to producing fictional but convincing urban legends, but people still debate whether or not this is something that really happened, similar to the birth of other stories like Slender Man or Jeff the Killer. I'm going to read it to you now, and I'll let you decide whether or not you think it's something that really took place. Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people awake for 15 days using an experimental gas-based stimulant. They were kept in a sealed environment to carefully monitor their oxygen intake so the gas didn't kill them since it was toxic in high concentrations. This was before closed-circuit cameras, so they had only microphones and 5-inch thick glass porthole-sized windows into the chamber to monitor them. The chamber was stocked with books, cots to sleep on but no bedding, running water and toilets, and enough dried food to last all 5 for over a month. The test subjects were political prisoners deemed enemies of the state during World War II. Everything was fine for the first 5 days. The subjects hardly complained, having been promised falsely that they would be freed if they submitted to the test and did not sleep for 30 days. Their conversations and activities were monitored, and it was noted that they continued to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents in their past, and the general tone of their conversations took on a darker aspect after the 4-day mark. After 5 days, they started to complain about the circumstances and events that led them to where they were, and started to demonstrate severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began alternately whispering to the microphones and one-way mirrored portholes. Oddly, they all seemed to think they could win the trust of the experimenters by turning over their comrades, the other subjects in captivity, with them. At first, the researchers suspected this was an effect of the gas itself. After 9 days, the first of them started screaming. He ran the length of the chamber, repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. He continued attempting to scream, but was only able to produce occasional squeaks. The researchers postulated that he had physically torn his vocal cords. The most surprising thing about his behavior is how the other captives reacted to it, or rather didn't react to it. They continued whispering to the microphones until the second of the captives started to scream. The 2 non-screaming captives took the books apart, smeared page after page with their own feces, and pasted them calmly over the glass portholes. The screaming promptly stopped. So did the whispering to the microphones. After 3 more days passed, the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure they were working, since they thought it impossible that no sound could be coming with 5 people inside. The oxygen consumption in the chamber indicated that all 5 must still be alive. In fact, it was the amount of oxygen 5 people would consume at a very heavy level of strenuous exercise. On the morning of the 14th day, the researchers did something they said they would not do to get a reaction from the captives. They used the intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke any response from the captives they were afraid were either dead or vegetables. They announced, "We are opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you your immediate freedom." To their surprise, they heard a single phrase in a calm voice response. "We no longer want to be freed." Debate broke out among the researchers and the military forces funding the research. Unable to provoke any more response using the intercom, it was finally decided to open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The chamber was flushed of the stimulant gas and filled with fresh air, and immediately voices from the microphones began to object. 3 different voices began begging, as if pleading for the life of a loved one, to turn the gas back on. The chamber was open and soldiers sent in to retrieve the test subjects. They began to scream louder than ever, and so did the soldiers when they saw what was inside. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although no one could rightly call the state that any of them were in life. The food rations past day 5 had not been so much as touched. There were chunks of meat from the dead test subject's thighs and chest stuffed into the drain in the center of the chamber, blocking the drain and allowing 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of the water on the floor was actually blood was never determined. All 4 surviving test subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies. The destruction of flesh and exposed bone on their fingertips indicated that the wounds were inflicted by hand, not with teeth as the researchers initially thought. Closer examination of the position and angles of the wounds indicated that most, if not all of them, were self-inflicted. The abdominal organs below the rib cage of all 4 test subjects had been removed. While the heart, lungs, and diaphragm remained in place, the skin and most of the muscles attached to the ribs had been ripped off, exposing the lungs through the rib cage. All the blood vessels and organs remained intact. They had just been taken out and laid on the floor, fanning out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of the subjects. The digestive tract of all 4 could be seen to be working, digesting food. It quickly became apparent that what they were digesting was their own flesh that they had ripped off and eaten over the course of days. Most of the soldiers were Russian special operatives at the facility, but still many refused to return to the chamber to remove the test subjects. They continued to scream to be left in the chamber and alternately begged and demanded that the gas be turned back on, lest they fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put up a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out, another was gravely injured by having his testicles ripped off, and an artery in his leg severed by one of the subject's teeth. Another 5 of the soldiers lost their lives if you count ones that committed suicide in the weeks following the incident. In the struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured and he bled out almost immediately. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of a morphine derivative and still fought like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and arm of one doctor. His heart was seen to beat for a full 2 minutes after he had bled out, to the point there was more air in his vascular system than blood. Even after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail for another 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone in reach and just repeating the word "more" over and over, weaker and weaker, until he finally fell silent. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility, the 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begging for the gas, demanding to be kept awake. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room that the facility had. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back within his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative they had given him to prepare for the surgery. He fought furiously against the restraints when the anesthetic gas was brought out to put him under. He managed to tear most of the way through a 4-inch wide leather strap on one wrist, even through the weight of a 200-pound soldier holding that wrist as well. It took only a little more anesthetic than normal to put him under, and the instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. In the autopsy of the test subject that died on the operating table, it was found that his blood had tripled the normal level of oxygen. His muscles that were still attached to his skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in the struggle to not be subdued. Most of them were from the force his own muscles had exerted on them. The second survivor had been the first of the group of 5 to start screaming. His vocal cords destroyed, he was unable to beg or object to surgery, and he only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought near him. He shook his head yes when someone suggested, reluctantly, they try the surgery without anesthetic, and did not react for the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what remained of his skin. The surgeon presiding stated repeatedly that it should be medically impossible for the patient to still be alive. One terrified nurse assisting the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, the subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk while struggling. Assuming this must be something of drastic importance, the surgeon had a pen and pad fetched so the patient could write his message. It was simple: keep cutting. The other 2 test subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetic as well, although they had to be injected with a paralytic for the duration of the operation. The surgeon found it impossible to perform the operation while the patients laughed continuously. Once paralyzed, the subjects could only follow the intending researcher with their eyes. The paralytic cleared their system in an abnormally short period of time, and they were soon trying to escape their bonds. The moment they could speak, they were again asking for the stimulant gas. The researchers tried asking why they had injured themselves, why they had ripped out their own guts, and why they wanted to be given the gas again. Only one response was given: "I must remain awake." All 3 subjects' restraints were reinforced, and they were placed back into the chamber awaiting determination as to what should be done with them. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors for having failed the stated goals of their project, considered euthanizing the surviving subjects. The commanding officer, an ex-KGB, instead saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected, but were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, all 3 stopped struggling the moment it was let slip they were going back on the gas. It was obvious that at this point all 3 were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of the subjects that could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds with all of his might, first left, then right, then left again for something to focus on. The remaining subject was holding his head off his pillow and blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired for EEG, most of the researchers were monitoring his brainwaves in surprise. They were normal most of the time, but sometimes flatlined inexplicably. It looked as if he were repeatedly suffering brain death before returning to normal. As they focused on paper scrolling out of the brainwave monitor, only one nurse saw his eyes slip shut at the same moment his head hit the pillow. His brainwaves immediately changed to that of deep sleep, then flatlined for the last time as his heart simultaneously stopped. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in now. His brainwaves showed the same flat lines as one who had just died from falling asleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside, as well as 3 researchers. One of the named 3 immediately drew his gun and shot the commander point blank between the eyes, then turned the gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out as well. He pointed his gun at the remaining subject, still restrained to a bed, as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room. "I won't be locked in here with these things. Not with you," he screamed at the man strapped to the table. "What are you?" he demanded. "I must know." The subject smiled. "Have you forgotten so easily?" the subject asked. "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread." The researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly choked out, "So nearly free." So again, that was most likely not a true story. There is no evidence of anything like this taking place, and honestly, it's probably not even physically possible. But it is a convincing story, and like I said, there are still people arguing that this is real. So what do you think? Did it happen? Or is something like that even plausible? I read one argument that said meth could cause hallucinations with a lack of sleep, so could there be another substance that could cause this kind of reaction that governments are now trying to keep secret? I'm not sure I believe that. I think it likely would have been weaponized by now, but again, I'll let you be the judge on that. Although this story may or may not really be true, there are some cases of human experimentation that actually did occur. One of these cases actually occurred in Russia. From 1921 to about 1979, the Soviet secret police established a covert research lab in which they tested different poisons on human test subjects. This lab, also known as Laboratory 1, Laboratory 12, or Camera, was led by prominent Soviet biochemist and poison developer Grigory Marinovsky. The goal of the study was to find a poison that would kill the subject, but then be untraceable after death. The victims used as test subjects in these studies were prisoners of the gulags, which was a system of forced labor camps, and the Soviet Union used to terrorize citizens and quell political dissent. Subjects were given the poison along with a meal or a drink and told it was medication. Of course, all of the victims died as they were testing known lethal poisons to come up with a compound that would give them the desired outcome of being untraceable after death. They tested poisons such as mustard gas, ricin, digitoxin, curare, and cyanide, to name a small number of the several they used. The testing did give them a compound that would be untraceable, but many basically innocent people died as a result. The tests were ultimately deemed inhumane, and those involved would be arrested for their actions. Possibly the most well-known cases of human experimentation are the tests done by the Nazis on the victims in the concentration camps. There were a large number of tests done, so I won't go into details on all of them, but to list a few of them, they did things like testing on twins, bone, muscle, and nerve transplants, experiments on head injuries, freezing experiments, experiments with malaria, immunizations, epidemic jaundice, mustard gas, sulfonamide, seawater, sterilization and fertility, poison, incendiary bombs, effects of high altitude, blood coagulation, and electroshock. All of these tests were horrible, and none of them were voluntary or humane. They were eventually classified as medical torture. Again, I won't talk about most of these, but I'll talk about a couple just to give you an idea of the kinds of things they would do to people. The first one I mentioned was the testing on twins. The goal of this was to show the similarities and differences in the genetics of twins. Doesn't sound that bad, really, right? Well, wrong. The tests were done on nearly 1,500 sets of twins, of which about 200 individual people survived the studies. Twins would be experimented on by doing things like injecting different dyes into their eyes to see if it would change the color, or sewing twins together in an attempt to create conjoined twins. The usual procedure was to keep one twin as a control as the other twin was tested on. But if the twin undergoing testing reached the point of death, the other twin would be brought in to be killed at the same time. Another just insane study done by the Nazis was the sterilization and fertility experiments. In 1933, a law was passed in Germany which allowed the involuntary sterilization of people with diseases claimed to be hereditary. But really, the goal was to encourage the growth of the Aryan race and put a stop to the reproduction of people they deemed undesirable. And as messed up as that idea is by itself, the testing was far worse. Through X-rays, surgery, and various drugs, Nazis experimented at Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, to name a couple of places, and performed exclusively on those in the camps. The goal was to come up with a sterilization method that the government could use to sterilize millions of people very quickly and with little effort. During these tests, unwilling victims were injected with drugs to try and block the fallopian tubes, had organs surgically removed, and some were even raped so that the doctors could study how the sperm traveled through the reproductive system. This study resulted in about 400,000 women being sterilized under the Nazi government control. People who have defected from North Korea have also claimed to have been witness to terrifying human experimentation. Again, there are several tests that have supposedly been performed. So to name a few, the knee and wood torture method, a torture method in which a prisoner is forced to kneel on a wooden bar that has been inserted into their knee, stopping blood flow and stunting their ability to walk. Testing anthrax on disabled children just to see how they would die. Testing gases intended for use with weapons by monitoring their victims who would be locked in a gas chamber. Practicing surgery on prisoners while awake and under no anesthesia, reportedly while the doctors were drunk and brutally torturing the prisoners. Forcing women to eat poisoned cabbage leaves just to see how they would die. Water torture testing, in which a small room would be filled with water up to the prisoner's nose, and they would be forced to stand on their toes to avoid drowning. And using human feces as fertilizer, and forcing the citizens of North Korea to consume the food grown from it. There was also some pretty horrific human experimentation done in Japan during World War II. These experiments, hidden under the guise of epidemic prevention, tested biological weapons on individual humans and sometimes entire towns. Nearly 500,000 people died as a result of this testing. None of the people involved in the testing were prosecuted for their crimes, as the US gave them immunity in exchange for the data gathered from the testing, which is just so messed up in my opinion. But the US is no stranger to human testing itself. The most obvious testing would be the MKUltra test, but I don't want to talk about those just yet. I may or may not be planning to do an entire episode on that. I have 3 more tests that I want to talk about, all of which took place in the United States. The first test was led by Dr. William Beaumont in 1825 on a man by the name of Alexis St. Martin in Fort Niagara, New York. St. Martin had been shot in the stomach and developed an open wound in his stomach that would not heal. Seeing an opportunity in this, Dr. Beaumont would use the hole to study the digestion process by tying bits of food to a string and lowering them into the hole for a few hours, then removing it to study the effects the gastric acid had on the food. He would also extract some stomach acid from St. Martin's study. While Dr. Beaumont's findings did change the understanding of the digestive process, and St. Martin was a willing test subject, these tests were excruciatingly painful for St. Martin. Another example in the U.S. was the testing of Dr. Leo Stanley on inmates in the San Quentin State Prison. He ran a number of tests on the inmates in the prison, but in the 1920s, Dr. Stanley would experiment in organ transplants between prisoners. But he wasn't curious about just any organs, he was focused on transplanting testicles. Dr. Stanley would take the testicles of deceased inmates and attempt to transplant them into a living prisoner, or sometimes even just swapping two living prisoners' testicles. These tests were performed under the theory that swapping older men's testicles with younger men's testicles would essentially rejuvenate the older men. That theory was obviously ridiculous, but the 20s were a different time and they believed some pretty crazy things back then. And the final experiment I want to talk about is the very well-known Stanford Prison Experiment. If you have not heard of the Stanford Prison Experiment, this was a voluntary psychological study done in 1971 on students at Stanford University in which participants were promised compensation. The experiment was conducted to investigate the psychological effects of perceived power, focusing on the struggle between prisoners and prison officers. Volunteers were separated into two groups, one group assigned as prisoners and one group assigned as prison guards. The result of the experiment was really pretty interesting as the test subjects quickly took to their assigned roles. However, the testing went way too far, leading to several of the officers to subject the prisoners to psychological torture. While some prisoners left the experiment early, others passively accepted the torture and even participated in torturing other prisoners when instructed to do so by the officers. The test was abandoned after 6 days, and many psychologists questioned the methodology in which the experiment was performed. There's also a pretty good film based around the experiment, simply called the Stanford Prison Experiment, if you want to watch an informative, dramatized version of the test. So, not much mystery with this week's topics, but I hope the subject matter was at least interesting and informative. After hearing several examples of human experimentation, do you think it's possible that the Russian sleep experiments could have happened? Let me know what you think by sending me an email. My email address is sywmtbpod@gmail.com. If you have any ideas for a future episode, feel free to email those to me as well. Before I go, just a reminder to check out my Patreon page if you would like to support the show. The link is posted in the show notes. Also, please like me on Facebook. The page is titled So You Want Me to Believe Podcast. And you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter. The handle is @sywmtbpod on both platforms. If you like the show, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Good ratings and reviews help others find the show and just really make me feel good about myself. And if you didn't like the show, hey, it's okay to be wrong sometimes. It happens to the best of us, but thanks for listening anyway. And that's all I have for you guys this time. Thanks for listening, and I will see you again next week.